Hello and welcome everyone to this, our third in the current series of the negotiation room. And today actually we have a session with a little bit of a difference. We as always have an invited expert, and on this occasion we're delighted to welcome Dr. Clive Rees, who is the Vice President and the International Chief Procurement Officer at Fujitsu. So Clive, welcome. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for inviting me, and looking forward to the session.
And I'm actually away from home today. I'm across in Bristol in the UK, where we have an audience of about 120 commercial managers from Babcock, leading engineering aerospace defence company here in the UK, and delivering a live session. And I think a number of them are listening in to us as well. As always, of course, it's wonderful to be joined by my co-conspirator in the negotiation room, Keld Jensen. And actually, Keld, today the spotlight's a little bit on you, and maybe you'd like to explain to our audience why.
Yeah, it's very unusual. Well, I still think the spotlight is on Clive, and I really appreciate, Clive, that you're taking out the time from your busy schedule to be here. No, I'm very lucky to be here and to being able to talk a little bit about my brand new book, Negotiation Essential. The fruit of hard labor, I would have to say, for a long time. And we've invited Clive to discuss the book and the content of the book. So I'm very excited to see, first and foremost, if Clive hated the book, and basically just having a dialogue around the book. So yeah, that's why we're here. And then obviously, Clive, I hope we can drag a little bit of your enormous experience out of you as well to share that with our audience. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, no, great. Happy to comment. And I thought the book was great, Keld.
Thank you, Clive.
Well, I'm sure that's a sigh of relief for you, Keld.
Let's continue the show then.
Yeah, sorry, we have to stop now. So actually, what I would like to start off with is a subject that keeps on coming back. We have many members who repetitively ask the question of, what about trust? How do you build trust? Is trust a prerequisite to a good negotiation, etc., etc.? That word keeps popping up. And the reason I think it's really interesting to start with that is because, Keld, I know you've got definite opinions on that, and you have covered that topic in the book. So I'd love to know, firstly, perhaps, what is the perspective you have on that whole question of trust in negotiation dynamics? And then, Clive, I think really interesting to get your viewpoint, because, of course, Fujitsu, as many of us probably know, is a Japanese firm by origin and based on headquarters. And of course, the trust dynamic in Japan has always been such a strong one.
Yeah.
So will be really interesting, I think, to get your perspective. And has Keld actually got it right in the position he takes? So, Keld, do you want to kick off and explain your position on this topic?
Yes, I think and I hope that we can all agree that trust is not only important, but essential to be successful. And I basically have 4 cornerstones that I'm talking about that is important and vital in negotiation, and one of them being trust. I actually renamed trust into trust currency. So I just took the 2 words, trust and currency, and put them together, because trust is not a fluffy, nice thing to have. It's actually a monetary value. It's something that is tangible. And listen very carefully. If we have a high level of trust in any collaboration, our transaction cost will go down and the profit will increase. And we can actually measure that. And one study we did that is included in the book is, and this might be interesting for you, Clive, is that we were studying procurement and basically gave them an option saying you can continue buying from a supplier that you like, you trust, you've been working with for years, that has a similar product to a new supplier that pops up. But the fun fact is that the new supplier, you don't really like that individual on a personal level. that, you know, chemistry is not working. You just don't really trust that individual. But the new supplier is offering the exact same product as the existing one that you like and trust. So how much more are you willing to pay from the one you like and trust, offering the same product compared to the one you don't like and don't trust? And here comes the shocking experience, Clive. We found that procurement officers were willing to pay all the way up to 38% more for a complicated advanced product compared to buying from the one that they didn't like and didn't trust. If we took a very simple commodity product, we found that they were willing to pay up to 8 to 10% more. So how about that, Clive? We can actually monetize trust. Do you think I'm right about that?
Well, let me start with an agreement, first of all, that trust is important, trust is vital, trust is essential in the business relationship. And what we do really in business is all about relationships, and it's all about, you know, internal relationships with the people that your internal stakeholders, your clients. You've got relationships then within your team, in my case, the procurement team across the globe. And then obviously a level of trust, and we'll come back to why I say a level of trust with your suppliers or your partners, however you deem to describe them or categorize them. So I think trust is part of that relationship, and without it, you will struggle. As for your comment around you can apply some monetary or numeric value to that level of trust, maybe it depends, and you know, I'd need to dig more into the detail of your research and who you asked and what types of questions you asked and how they were structured and what type of responses you got back. So to an extent I agree, because I think there is a level of money that can be retained by the organization, saved, if you like, costs that can be avoided if you have a relationship that works for you. Obviously, it's got to work for both parties. And, you know, one of the biggest failings is we see trust as one way. Trust has got to be two ways. You've got to be trusted as well as you've got to trust the other party.
Absolutely.
And to Tim's comment earlier, and I'm sure you both had experience of working with Japanese-based, headquartered-based companies. I've had 10 years now at Fujitsu, and what a wonderful company it is. But it is very much built on trusting partners and making sure that those relationships are long-term. And to that extent, it takes a big shift and a big event or a sequence of changes or a sequence of letdowns for Fujitsu to consider moving some of its more strategic partners or relationships away from the ones they've got. So I agree with the comment about, you know, a lot of people will want to stay with what they're used to and will want to stay with the company that they have signed up for. Doesn't mean that we're naive or reluctant to change, but I agree with the contention that, you know, you'll get more from fixing a relationship or being open to try and say to the other party what you want to improve, and that ongoing dialogue has to happen. But there are occasions where we will move and we will shift. So the contention of is a monetary value, not sure, maybe. I agree, though, that, you know, from a Japanese cultural perspective, and no doubt we'll come on to culture and the role that plays in negotiations. You know, we certainly, I've experienced wanting to stay with the same company and being prepared to go through the bumps and being prepared to live through the ups and downs.
Actually, if we could, I just continue on that theme, and then I'll come back to you, Keld. We'll do it the other way around. You're touching obviously on issues there where there is perhaps non-performance, and where what you're describing is obviously a situation where your preference is to get back to stability and good performance. So where does negotiation play from that point of view? What sort of strategies would you take from a negotiation perspective if you were dealing with a series of poor performances or promises that haven't been met.
Is that to me or to Keld?
It is, and then we're going to test out with Keld whether he's got the right answers.
So Keld and I had a quick catch up before we came on, and we were talking about some of these aspects in terms of, you know, the need to be open and transparent with each other in a business sense. And, you know, one of my points and a question back to Keld that I'm sure he'll comment on is that generally people in business don't tend to start with the open or transparent or trusting type of approach. They come to it with some degree of suspicion, cynicism, and maybe that's just the people in procurement, but, you know, business experience tends to taint some people, and they're nervous, even though at the start of a relationship, you know, you should be clear about what you expect from the other party, and the other party should be clear what they expect from you. But, you know, my experiences are that people are hesitant, reluctant to be open, and that then, you know, sometimes can change, and you can build with positive experiences that level of trust and openness. And, you know, in Keld's book, he talks about some of this, but, you know, the other extreme is people never get away from that level of suspicion, and they start to diverge even further apart during the course of a relationship. So I think if you start off as you mean to go on, I know that sounds very high level and a bit sort of simple and fundamental, but if you start as you mean to go on, I think it can only then improve the level of openness and transparency. But Keld?
Yes, first and foremost, I completely agree with you, Clive. Unfortunately, there seems to be a trend that has only been developed throughout the years, and is perhaps even worse today, that you meet up with a counterpart and you start being very closed off, and you know, you're not open, and you don't have the trust level. And I think, Clive and Tim, it's actually even interesting that we're even sitting here debating trust, because it should just be a natural thing. And it's actually remarkable that we need to verbalize this and talk about it, because it is kind of step one in any relationship between human beings, isn't it? It starts with the baby that is trusting the parents, and then you grow up and you have siblings and friends, and you know, as I mentioned to Clive in our talk prior to going live, it's actually interesting, because I don't remember my parents in my upbringing trying to teach me to not trust people, and holding back information, and bluffing and lying, and, you know, having no trust. That was not the upbringing that I remember I had. It was quite opposite. My parents tried to tell you that, you know, you have to be open and honest and trust people, and blah blah blah, and all of that. So anyway, back to what you just said, Clive. Absolutely, I completely agree with you. And let me just take one step back, because what we actually preaching to our clients and students, and what I'm talking about in the book as well, is that we actually have to negotiate on how to negotiate before we start negotiating. And what I mean by that is that we perceive negotiation very differently. Clive, you may perceive negotiation like playing chess. I may perceive it like playing tennis. So when we meet up, we actually have to invest a little bit of time agreeing on how we want to conduct our negotiation. And I think one thing that is important for everybody to understand is that most business relationships today are actually relationship. It's not a commodity deal where Fujitsu is just buying a thing one time from one supplier and they will never ever see them again. I suspect that's not the case, Clive. It's a long-term continuing relationship. And imagine you're stepping in and in a marriage, and you don't have trust in your counterpart. I don't think any people would marry anybody that they don't trust in general. But in a business world, we see sometimes companies working together for years and years and really haven't developed that relationship. So trying to answer your question, one of the things we need to do is agreeing on how we want to negotiate, so we are not surprised about the reaction of the counterpart. And part of that agreeing on how to negotiate is actually verbalizing trust. So talking about trust. And the fun part, Clive, and I would love your take on that, is sometimes when I preach that we have to verbalize trust before we even start negotiating, I meet some business people and say, you can't do that. You know, it's almost like a taboo. You can't mention that word trust. And I say, why not? It is so essential. It is so important for you to be successful and for me to be the same. So we need to talk about what happens if trust is declining. What can we do, you and I together, Clive, to increase trust? And how can we make sure that we actually capitalize the best out of the relationship based on, among other things, trust? So my advice is really talking about it once, and also being allowed to mention it to the counterpart, a little bit depending on culture as well, but being allowed to mention to the counterpart, I have a feeling that trust is declining right now. Can we do anything to get it back on track?
It's fascinating. Of course, and I'm not an anthropologist, Keld, but I might well become one after this conversation, or at least I might well ask ChatGPT for its opinion. I would hypothesize that actually very often high trust cultures simply don't survive. When you look back through history, those societies that have actually operated with high levels of trust have often found themselves vulnerable, sadly, to aggression from less trusting people. And equally, if trust were such a fundamental economic asset, you would expect that high trust cultures would be significantly better off economically than low trust cultures. But maybe it doesn't always translate to money. Maybe it also translates more importantly to quality of life. But it's certainly a fascinating area that we probably need to dig further into. But to Clive's point, I think obviously with our experiments in the negotiation room with our mock negotiations, absolutely reinforced and endorsed Clive's point. Those teams that were open and transparent achieved far better results, far faster. So I think we can absolutely say that whether you convert that into trust or not, it is perhaps not so important. It is that issue of being ready to be open and transparent that's so critical. You talk in the book, and Clive, I know you've got a few questions you want to pose and raise too, so I'm going to let you pick one of your favorite topics after this one. First of all, let's just talk about the whole, it sort of continues, I guess, from this mental state, the whole issue of the zero-sum game. And particularly that very often, I think, comes in, Keld, and you talk about it in the book, when we're perhaps either at the end of agreement or we're actually perhaps on the brink of termination. So we're looking at adjustments, or we're looking at dispute resolutions, which very often do seem to turn into that zero-sum game. So how can negotiators get through that type of situation where clearly trust has broken down to reach some sort of mutually beneficial outcome?
Sure, that's a great question. Just back to your comment previously, Tim, about trust and how important it is. I think it wasn't it Leaning that at one point talked about control or trust, and we rephrased that into control is good, but trust is cheaper. Because it is very expensive to control and double check and summarize everything that is happening all the time instead of having a certain level of trust. I have to say, though, it's not a question about trusting or being naive. Of course, we shouldn't be naive, but have a reasonable trust in what we're doing. Back to your question, Tim, right now. One thing, just before we dive into the very positional negotiation, zero-sum negotiation, we have to define a strategy in our organization. And quite often, Clive, when I am working with organizations your size, I'm often teasing them a little bit by saying, could you share with me, please, your official negotiation strategy in your organization? And I don't know about your company, because we haven't talked about it, Clive, but quite often I find that organization, even very well-known international huge organization, don't have an official negotiation strategy. And for those who claim they have, some of them actually don't have a strategy, they just have a tactic. So even before we step into any kind of negotiation, whether it's client side, supply side, whatever negotiation we're in, we need to figure out how do we want to negotiate. And if we take the world very simply black and white, typically we can choose positional, zero-sum, or more collaborative. And what I unfortunately see sometimes is that individual negotiators, they find their own strategy. So if you have, let's say, 200 people in your procurement part, you may see that you have 150 different approaches to negotiation, because people negotiate the way they were trained and experienced and learned throughout life. And some of them are more collaborative and some of them are more serious sum orientated. So we need to identify, obviously, when do we want to be serious sum orientated and when do we need to be more collaborative? And that's simply a choice in my world based on who we're dealing with. You know, in some cases, I am definitely personally in favor of more collaborative negotiation because I know it generates more value to everybody around the table. But that doesn't mean that we can rule out that we should never be positional and actually negotiate in serious sum. But it has to be a purpose choice. And unfortunately, Clive, and I would love your take on this, I see sometimes negotiators stumble into a conference room and accidentally end up in a very serious sum negotiation, or accidentally end up in a very collaborative negotiation. And it wasn't really a conscious choice. It just happened as a result of how the counterpart reacted, how they behaved, what they said, and so on and so forth. What's your take on that, Clive?
Well, yeah, I think you have to have a pre-agreed approach at the start. And you have to understand who you're negotiating with, the context of that organization, the context of the negotiation in terms of how important it is to that organization, and vice versa. So you'll know where this sits in level of importance to your own organization. You've got to understand where it sits and how important it is for the other party that you're negotiating with. So I think you can have that pre-discussion with your team about to your view as to the spectrum of zero sum or collaborative. But I think you have to have a level of adaptability, and you have to be able to step back a little bit and see what is actually happening when it starts. And you know, it's a bit of a link to sport, which I've done a lot of in the past, where it's easy to stand back when you're not on the pitch, as it were, or not on the whatever the stadium is, and you're in there watching. But when you're on there playing the game, it's very difficult to assess what's happening and whether you've got to change your style and change your approach and move more towards a slightly non-collaborative for a particular topic, but you can still have an overall strategy that you return to. So I think, and this is maybe into the tactics of it, but you know, going in with a certain approach, realizing when that approach is working or not working, having the ability to call some time out, step back, and then discuss with your team whether you take a slightly different approach. So, you know, that's a bit into the detail, a bit into the process, but that does affect how you open your strategy and whether you continue with that all the way through. So, you know, I don't know whether you agree and whether Tim wants to comment, but Keld, that seems to me to be the one of the key points is the level of adaptability. And did you find that in some of your research and some of your work that you did for the book?
Oh, I absolutely agree, Clive. I mean, you know, we can sit here and plan everything we want, and then we're going to meet the counterpart and they say something or do something that we didn't plan for at all. And then, you know, all the planning we did for the last 3 days is out the window, and now we have to have a plan B. So I completely agree with you. We might have an intention to do something. You know, you can drag the horse to the water, but you can't force it to drink, right? So if you are programmed and your ambition is to be very collaborative, that's great, as long as the counterpart is playing along with that. But if you're meeting a counterpart that doesn't want to do it, don't see the benefit, or don't have the interest, well, you can't force them into any kind of working together mode, right? So then you have two choices. You can either pack your bags and leave and say, I don't want to do business with them, or you can try and close the whole thing in serious sum. And is that possible? Obviously it is, because millions of negotiations are being closed every day around the world in absolutely 100% serious sum. What I just know, Clive, is that the second we conclude a deal in serious sum, we leave value on the table, and that goes for both parties. So financially, in most cases, it's not a healthy thing to do that. But still, there could be a multitude of reasons why we need to negotiate in serious sum.
And maybe, if I can continue, Tim, maybe, Keld, that's why when you talk about this asymmetric value creation in your book, maybe for the people listening or watching, you could explain a little bit of that and why you think that's so important.
Oh, yes. The asymmetric value is very important. It's a concept we call negoeconomics, which basically just is short for negotiation economics. And what we have identified is that two parties negotiating with each other typically leave up to 42% of the value on the table. And let me give you a very quick example. Let's say that Clive and I are negotiating, and we are negotiating one of the variables, could be terms of payment. Instead of just sitting haggling back and forth saying, I want a 90 days line of credit, and Clive says, well, you can only have 10, and then we end up somewhere in the middle, I get 25 or whatever. That's what happens typically in a zero-sum game. Instead, we should actually be open, transparent, and sharing our cost of capital. So I might say, well, you know what, Clive, my cost of capital is 3%. And Clive might say, well, that's interesting. My cost of capital is 7%. Oh, wow, there you go. The asymmetric value here is obviously the difference between the 7 and the 3, which in this case would be 4%. So what makes sense here? Well, I shouldn't get a long line of credit. We should actually turn around and I should make an upfront payment. Because if I make an upfront payment, I'm saving Clive 7%. It will cost me 3, but Clive have to compensate me. So the asymmetric value is obviously 4%. So Clive and I would sit down and then negotiate the split of the asymmetric value. And I might be able to leave then with 5% of that value, and I would save Clive 2%. So it's basically sitting down, discussing every variable and identifying, is that difference between my counterpart's benefit or cost compared to my benefit and cost. And back to what I just said, Clive, I see, unfortunately, every single week, major negotiations where the parties are happy, conclude the deal, shake hands, sign the contract, and leave, but they don't realize, identify, or have capitalized that value on the table because they haven't been transparent, which is obviously connected to our previous topic, trust.
Yeah, it is certainly the point you make about adaptability is a critical one, I think, Clive. And of course, we've seen that in such a dynamic way over the last 3-4 years, that need to be adaptive in our thinking, which of course then translates through into the approach we take within negotiation. We've been doing some interesting testing actually around adaptability of individuals and teams, because of course adaptability to work is not really down purely to the individual. It's also when they work in an environment that encourages adaptability. And our early tests of this suggest that by nature, only about 16% of the typical procurement commercial community is adaptive by nature and sort of, intrinsically adaptive. Around another 40% are open to being adaptive, and about 40% are not really adaptive because they're still stuck, I guess, in a compliance world. We sort of building on what we have been talking about, Keld, you also talk in the book about the importance of debrief. And I don't think many people would disagree with that, they probably won't disagree that, well, it's important we really actually do it. So let's not spend too much time on why it's important, because I think that's self-evident. But in the book, you talk a bit about the nature of that debrief. What are the sort of critical things that you advocate we should be covering and capturing?
First and foremost, I'm a great fan of checklists. I'm sharing a bunch of checklists in the book as well that we've been using for years with our clients. And the reason I love checklists, not that we should be completely fanatic about them, because back to what Clive said, things may change. So we have to be flexible on the checklist as well. But I have just, throughout my career, I've seen too many negotiators that's basically the preparation time they take before they head into a negotiation is the travel time they have from their own office to the counterpart's office. So I'm hoping that they have a long flight so they have time to do that preparation, right? So debriefing and preparation are kind of linked, because typically I see people that do a thorough preparation are often better at doing the debriefing as well. Now, one of the many reasons that I love checklists is we can learn a lot from the from the airlines, right? Because they've been doing that for years, and they know that if a pilot forgets something, that could be a disaster. So when you board a plane and the door to the flight deck is opened, and I know, Clive, you are traveling a lot as well, you might have seen a pilot sitting out there with a checklist. I've seen that numerous times. And do you know what, Clive? I don't think the pilot is sitting with that checklist because he or she have no clue on how to fly that Airbus. I don't think that's the case. They are sitting with a checklist because they know, as human beings, we sometimes forget something. And if a pilot forgets to push a button, that could be a disaster. And it could actually cost 140 people their life, right? When you and I are negotiating, if we forget to press a button, hopefully nobody is dying, but we might be losing $140,000 right there. So checklist is a thing I would recommend every single organization to implement. And there's kind of a required checklist you just have to go through before you start negotiating anything. And the same thing goes for debriefing. We have what we call a post-negotiation audit, where you basically are debriefing, going through everything, even before you conclude and sign the final contract, just to make sure, did we cover that? Did we ask that question? Did we go through all the variables? Did we identify macroeconomics? Did we use the right approach? Did we follow our strategy? Blah, 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 all of that. So to me, it's really inexpensive negotiation training, do debriefing with your colleagues that were attending that negotiation with you, because hopefully most people here in any important negotiation are negotiating in a team. That's another thing we talk about in the book. You are not capable of negotiating on your own. That's a different topic. But when you're done with your negotiation, debrief with your manager, debrief with your own team. And in some cases, and this is kind of fun, actually debrief with your counterpart.
Yeah.
So sit down and talk about with your counterpart, what did you feel about this? Were you okay? Were you happy with the transaction? And, you know, really debrief with everybody around you. And again, too many people just run out of the room and celebrating, hey, we signed the contract. If they did, it's wonderful. Then moving on to the next one and having learned absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
What's your take on that, Clive?
Yeah, I think people are afraid of debriefing with the other party in case they feel they've been sort of shortchanged, or in case they feel that they've given something away that was hugely valuable to the other party. But that brings me back to where we started on the level of trust, openness, and transparency. So I think be brave, debrief with the other team, and I think that's important. But brings me back and makes me think as well about the question of, to what extent, and some of this is picked out in your book, to what extent are negotiators born, or are they taught, created, skilled because they've been sort of trained by even your good self? So, you know, born or created and taught?
Yeah, I have a wonderful answer that I've adopted from the world of politics, Clive, and that the answer is it depends.
Yeah.
You know, in my world, us who claims that we know something about negotiation, we discuss internally whether it's an art or science. You know, is negotiation an art or a science? And I would say it depends, and I really believe it's both. If it was only an art, you would be born into being a natural negotiator. I don't believe that's the case. I think it's a skill set that everyone can learn if they get trained. So that certainly moves it into a science. So, but on the other hand, you also need to like it. And what I mean by that is, we conducted a study where we actually found that enormous amount of professional negotiators, if you ask them honestly, they dislike to negotiate. And we actually found through that study as well that 20%, and I repeat that 20%, that's 1 out of 5 professional negotiators, are actually not very good at negotiating. So they are actually incompetent in the science of negotiation. We're very curious why. Why is that there's so many that is actually not really good negotiators? And it was not based on lack of experience, because you could have 23 years of experience and still be a lousy negotiator, having negotiated for 23 years. But what we found, Clive, and I'm just circling back, is that the main reason that those 20% were incompetent was because they dislike to negotiate. Because I think we can all, as human beings, agree that we tend to be better at something that we truly like and enjoy, right? So I would like to ask our audience right now, and you don't have to reply, please don't, but do you actually like to negotiate? Because if you can answer that question by saying, yes, I really like it, it's fun, it's exercising, That's where we create value. There's a huge possibility that you're actually a good negotiator. On the other hand, if you're, no, I would rather not. I would rather sit in my room, look at the screen and work on the contract details and then let somebody else deal with the counterpart. If that's your answer, you're probably not a good negotiator. So that's really, really a very important step before anything else, that we realize where we're coming from. Do we enjoy doing what we're doing? And then obviously there are some human characters that we can put on the more skilled negotiator if we should stay in the world of it being an art. But I would support the scientific side more, saying there's a huge list of items where we can clearly identify this is a skilled negotiator based on science.
But I guess you agree, maybe you don't, tell me. There are different roles to play in a negotiation team, aren't there? And a lead negotiator can be a different person from your analyst, from your numbers guy, from your I'll take a sort of high level view, or so I think if it's the same with everything, you know, building the right skill sets within the team, having the right person to lead the team and front up. I think that combination of different characters, different personalities does help, depending, of course, what you're negotiating and with whom. But I think a team and the composition of the team is important.
I absolutely agree, Clive, and I love you saying that, because I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that important part. Our study was based on the head of the team. So that means if the head of the team disliked negotiation, it was probably not going as good as it possibly could go. What we talk about in general, and I mentioned that in the book, is exactly as you mentioned right now, Clive. We need a team. We need a head of the negotiation. We need what we call a calculator, and we need a note taker. And that's a minimum requirement for any professional negotiation team. And a note taker is basically the memory of the team. He or she will be the one that remembers what we've been talking about, often very good at asking questions, summarizing what has been happening. The calculator goes with the title, is the one that is in charge of numbers, that knows what, are we ahead, are we behind? And the head of the team, and this is actually quite often the position that understand the least of what's actually going on. Because for everybody here who's listening in, who's been sitting as a head of negotiation in any vital big negotiation, you will know how tough that role is. You have to remember what has happened, what questions you want to ask, listen carefully to the counterpart, know the order of the variables. You know, there's just too many things going on. You can't cope with all of that. So first and foremost, just as Clive points out, we need a team. And secondly, we need to have divided the roles and have discipline in that team.
Clive, we obviously have over the years seen erosion of the face-to-face live negotiation. I think you know, many people, it had crept up on them, and of course the pandemic was such a shock because suddenly there was face-to-face negotiation. In reality, as research Keld and I did, that of course was not actually such a cataclysmic change. It was obviously highly noticeable, but you must have witnessed that, particularly in your teams spread around the world as they are. What impact, good or bad, do you feel the shift to greater frequency of virtual negotiation has had?
That's me, Tim. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I guess that brings you into the areas, things like, and Keld's got a big section in the book about the importance of body language compared to, you know, verbal content, and the content of what you're actually saying and how you position yourself, and the mood and of your voice and the body language. And I think face-to-face is better than virtual. I think you can read more if you're with somebody face to face. But you know, as we've all learned in the last 3 years or however long it's been now, obviously things are changing now. But I thought personally, I struggled with teams negotiation, depending on who you were talking to and what type of relationship you had. But you know, and also what culture you were dealing with as well, because certain cultures will be happier to do things virtually than they are face to face. So I think there's a combination of body language type issues compared to actual content, what people are saying, and also cultural differences affect how people prioritize the topics and deal with the topics in negotiation, and what they actually say in the room, or what happens out of the room, and those types of topics. So that's why I think it's always better to be together with the other party. But Keld, your view?
Yeah, it was funny when Tim and I did this study. It was one of those typical areas where we didn't naturally agree from the beginning, which is always fun. Because Tim came to me and said, I think majority of negotiations are happening virtually today. And I said, no, they're not, Tim. That's crazy. People are meeting up face to face. And this was even pre-COVID. And then we did the study, and Tim was right. We found that 70% of negotiation were predominantly or completely conducted virtually. And as I said, that was just right before COVID. So the number obviously went up through COVID, and it's probably even higher today. Who knows? But the fun part of our study was, Clive, that at the same time, 95% of all negotiators admits that meeting face-to-face is way better. And I have met a bunch of chief financial officers who are so thrilled about the virtual meetings, because they're saying, look at how much we're saving on travel and hotels and time spent. And I say, yes, I get that, but you haven't calculated how much you're losing by not meeting up face-to-face. Now, I do believe certainly we can negotiate virtually. I think it's a great thing, and we should definitely do it. But I recommend typically that we do it as part of the negotiation process. Now, most negotiation obviously is not just one meeting and we're done. You know, most negotiation is we having a meeting and then we go back and think about something and then we have another meeting. Most negotiation drags on for months or some even years, right? So yes, you can obviously have virtual meetings during the process, but I recommend every single of my clients, if you're meeting with somebody who is important to you and you're important to them as well, make the effort, get on that plane, go there, see them face to face, shake their hands, have dinner, sit down, talk about something else than business. It will just remarkably increase the option of you being successful. And I just want to add one more thing, Clive, and that is the fun part about virtual versus face-to-face is that if I were negotiating with you, Clive, right, and we met up on Zoom, I have basically not invested anything in this meeting. All I invested is turning on Zoom and sitting here talking with you. So if I don't like our conversation, like you, or think we are in agreement, I can end this meeting by pressing a button, meeting's done, right? But if I had to travel from California to the UK to meet up with you, I have invested money, time, and effort. So when I'm sitting there, I'm actually more keen to be successful. So I will invest more in that negotiation than if I'm just meeting virtually. And we have to think about that as well.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. But please let me come to you. UK is so much more dreary than the other topic, maybe to just explore briefly, Tim, with Keld, is this concept that you refer to, smart. What do you call it again?
Partnership.
Smartnership. Yeah. So maybe it's worth digging into that a little.
Yes, absolutely. Basically we could call it partnership version 2.0 because it's really a smart partnership. And both partnership and smartnership is in the world of collaboration. Just backtracking a little bit, we talked about zero-sum positional approaches or collaborative approaches a few minutes ago. When we're talking about collaborative approaches, the reason that we developed something above partnership is because throughout the years, I've been doing this for many, many years now, I have found a lot of organizations, Clive, that when you ask them what's your approach to your negotiation, they say partnership. We're definitely in partnership with our suppliers and we're in partnership with our clients. And then when you dive in, dig in and look for the details, you actually experience quite often that they're really in a long-term zero-sum game. So, you know, they're just repeating zero-sum over and over again, and they've been doing it for 8 years with this supplier, this client, and then they call it partnership. But that's not a partnership. That's a long-term zero-sum that they've been involved in. So the big difference between partnership and smartnership is that in a smartnership, the parties have agreed on rules of the game. That means they have negotiated on how they want to negotiate. They have agreed on trust, so they've verbalized trust. They have, they have identified and expanded the number of variables. And let me just touch upon that for a minute. What I have found as well is that too many organizations are simply negotiating on too few variables. They are negotiating on the usual suspect, price, delivery, warranty, right of return, installation, what have you. 7, 8, 9, 10 commercial variables. And quite often there is a lot more out there that you basically just have to identify, capitalize, and use in your negotiation. So they have, as a teamwork exercise with the counterpart, been sitting with the counterpart and expanded those variables even before they start negotiating. And the last one, and the big difference between partnership and partnership as well, is the concept of negoeconomics that we talked about before. So they are focusing on how can we utilize, create, and capitalize that additional value. So these items are the main difference in what we call partnership compared to partnership. So it's basically just a developed smart partnership where we are working even more closely together in what I would call an informed collaboration.
And I assume that includes sharing strategic roadmaps about long-term plans that then the other party can see where you're headed and how they fit in. Because, in my experiences, that's always a factor that helps the deal, if you like, and the topic is understanding where the deal fits in the context of what you're trying to do strategically.
Yes. Having said that, yes, I agree, Clive. I want to add something, one more thing. That is, I often get the question, but could there be zero-sum negotiation as part of this partnership negotiation? Absolutely. I mean, you could start off in zero-sum, you could move into partnership, and you could actually sometimes find yourself in a zero-sum wrapping up that whole approach as well. Because what you're doing in partnership is you're trying to create value and distribute value. Now, creating value is teamwork. That's something you do with your counterpart. In order to make 2 + 2 = 4, more than 4, you can't do that on your own. You need your counterpart. So that's a group exercise. Now, splitting that value sometimes ends up in a zero-sum game where the more powerful one at the table gets the majority of the deal. But let me just share something really important. It is better, way better, to only get 5 or 10% of the value in a partnership negotiation than getting 90% in zero-sum, because you will still leave the table a lot wealthier in partnership, only getting the smaller part of the value than getting the majority of the value in zero-sum. So people have to think about the whole fairness thing, which from a psychology point of view is very difficult for human beings. But you have sometimes in a partnership negotiation, agree with and be happy walking away with the smallest amount of the value.
Yep.
I think one of the other pieces of research we did, Keld, looked at the frequency with which people felt they were dealing with a non-negotiator, that actually the counterparty was putting people forward that had no authority to meaningfully negotiate, and in fact they were really more of a barrier to negotiation rather than somebody who could or would negotiate. And we have talked in the past about how you deal with that, but it does strike me the conversation you've just had there is a case in point that if only we were testing the counterparty's readiness for negotiation, we would save a lot of time and effort trying to battle our way past somebody who actually has no serious intent. And that also, I think, takes into the interesting area of ethics in negotiation. I know you'll cover that quite a lot in the book too. Well, what are some key points from an ethical perspective?
Yeah, well, I would love to hear Clive's take on that as well. Clive, you are internationally very experienced, and ethics is perceived slightly different around the world. So ethics in one region may not necessarily be ethics in another region. Now we have created what I call a code of conduct in negotiation that is in the book as well, which is basically a piece of paper that we introduce in the beginning of any negotiation with our client. And so the way it works is that the code of conduct explains how we want to behave. For instance, it says, we will not bluff and lie. Please tell us if you believe that we have been holding back any kind of information, vital data or whatever. So we just go through a lot of items, how we want to behave in that negotiation. So what we do out in real life is we present this piece of paper to the counterpart. We say, this is how we want to go about this negotiation. And then we sign that piece of paper and ask the counterpart to do the same. And this is actually a very interesting moment during that pre-negotiation phase, just to see the reaction of the counterpart, because there's really nothing outstanding or surprising on the code of conduct, because it's basically just human behavior, how we should behave, how we should conduct the whole process, right? But it gets a little bit provoking to the counterpart that we suddenly put it in writing. Now, it doesn't have any legal impact whatsoever. So it's basically just kind of raising a signal how we want to conduct negotiation. Because back to my world of partnership and trust and being transparent, it is so essentially important to create that additional value. But Clive, what's your take on that? I mean, could you introduce a code of conduct and talk about ethics in all parts of the world? Or would there be some parts of the world where they just look at you and saying, you're crazy?
No, I've done something similar in the past, but I think you're right. Depending on who you're talking to, and there will be certain cultures, certain nationalities that will agree with everything you say, and then maybe when you get to the stage of get the markup of either the notes of the meeting or even of drafting a contract, what's actually written is somewhat different to what they've agreed to. So I think there are certain cultures, and I'll stop short of calling them out, that will agree too readily, too easily, and then will backtrack in the written contract or agreements. And then just jumping back to a point that Tim was making and that you commented on as well, I think it's really important to find out the level of authority that the other lead person has got. And I know it sounds an obvious thing, but who is the real decision maker? What's the approval process? Because the bigger the corporate, the more convoluted the approval process is, depending on the value of the deal or the contract. So, you know, who is the real decision maker? What is the authority of the person in front of you? What approval process has that person got to follow? How long is it going to take? Because there's always a timeline, and deadlines are imposed, sometimes false deadlines, and they come and go and nothing happens, and still the deal's on the table. So I think, you know, internal approval processes, key decision makers are important, as well as understanding this general concept of ethics and how the parties work together, and being aware that some people will agree too readily, I think is part of the whole picture as well.
I absolutely agree, Clive. I normally say you should only negotiate with somebody who got the mandate. Because it's so complicated negotiating with somebody who doesn't have that. Unfortunately, Clive, I have experienced in my career that some organizations purposely send in negotiators who don't have the mandate. And you know, then they can escalate that negotiation later on, and then, you know, move up and move up and move up, and every time they take a piece of that negotiation, that value away from you. So it could actually be a strategy from the counterpart.
So I'm conscious we're almost out of time, so I would like to perhaps pose a final question to each of you. Maybe you can take up to a couple of minutes just giving you the thoughts. Maybe we could start with you. And it is, you know, we have seen the field of negotiation and what is negotiated changed quite substantially over the last 25, 30 years. I mean, you know, looking at Fujitsu, for example, the services that you provide, from outsourcing and technology support, etc., fundamentally different from the origins of particularly sort of ICO, etc., where you were selling equipment. So negotiation has obviously changed and adapted. As you look forward from here, facing as we are new technologies, artificial intelligence, etc., any thoughts or forecasts in how you think negotiation will change over the next few years?
No, great question. And you can't have any discussion without talking about artificial intelligence these days. And I recently presented at a conference around whether attitude and approach would, from a human intervention perspective, would prevail over the use of artificial intelligence and learned intelligence that you could then apply. And my hope and my view would be that there'll always be a place for this face-to-face negotiation. And I think the artificial intelligence will make it sort of easier to get to the core quicker. But I'm not simplifying all the research that you've done and that Keld's done and the book, but I think it has to be a person-led event. But the data and the information that will come through artificial intelligence will help us get to a better solution quicker, would be my view. Keld?
Yeah, I have a funny take on this, and people often get surprised when I talk about it, because I'm not so much in favor of virtual negotiation, but I am in favor of the use of AI in negotiation. Because everything I've done so far, and Tim and I with World CC did a really fun study where we had teams using ChatGPT negotiating with other teams using ChatGPT, and then we compared that to negotiations where only one side were using ChatGPT and the other one wasn't. And then we had a control group where nobody was using ChatGPT, just negotiating traditionally without the use of any AI. And it was remarkable, Clive, the result we got. Teams using ChatGPT versus team using ChatGPT outperformed everyone else. They utilized the value better, talking about trust, transparency were better. They were done before time. The preparation was better. I can't really find anything that they did worse than anybody else. So if we can trust that study, we can just say ChatGPT, as just one of many AI tools, improve the negotiation process a lot. And my take on this, Clive, is that I hope you're right. I hope there's still room for human beings in the future. But what I'm stating around the world today is that I don't think AI will replace human beings right now, but negotiators using AI will replace negotiators not using AI. So my recommendation, without any doubt, is that if you're in negotiation and you haven't played around with AI, you can only start right now, and that's almost too late. You have to get into the world of AI, because it's going to be the biggest revolution to negotiation that we have seen for hundreds of years, without any doubt.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, we have one final sort of, I don't know if it's an optimistic viewpoint. Adam has asked the question, is there a chart or table based on previous negotiation capturing the industries and items and the achievable discount rates for ranges of total cost of contract? For example, in automotive, if you've got a 100,000 to 250,000 component, the average achievable is 15.6%. But I don't think so. But actually, in our world of AI, who knows? It may well be that this sort of consolidated data will increasingly become available and accessible to us in real time. But I'm not sure I'm going to hold my breath on that one. Are you, Clive?
No.
And so I guess the mystery of the relative achievements of negotiators is often going to remain somewhat of a mystery. But I think what we do know is, or can say with reasonable confidence, is that companies and individuals that really do develop and build competence and consistency into the way they plan and execute negotiations are subject to their having good products and services, generally going to outperform the companies that have not made those investments. So, well, thank you, Keld, so much, but particularly thank you to you, Clive, for not only participating today, but also navigating your way through Keld's book so that you can be our online live book critic today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Keld.
Thank you, Clive.
Bye, guys.
And we will be back with another series of the negotiation room in February, I believe. So we hope to see you back then. Bye for now.